Now remember that I promised you that because the Oilers are going to be playing the Jets this upcoming Monday, that I was going to segue back to the Winnipeg Jets as a part of this topic. And now I'm going to. Because we are actually seeing in a lot of other places in the league, not only places where similar situations, such as the similar situations to the Shane Corson and Jason Arnott situation have actually happened, but we're actually seeing all sorts of other places where they could happen or where they could get much, much worse. And so as I segue back to the Winnipeg Jets, I'd actually like to start with a story that happened a few years ago. And so this was really a surprising thing that happened with the Ottawa Senators. Was that at a certain point a few years ago, the Ottawa Senators, they were riding high. A lot of people thought that they were, if not just on the cusp of a Stanley Cup run, that they were about to be within the next couple of years. They had arguably the best defenseman in the league in Erik Karlsson. They had a very strong and gifted offensive core around him, and just everything seemed to be working out for the Senators. Perhaps even more so than that period of time in the mid 2000s where they had that very strong European core of players. And they looked like they were ready to bust out and make that cup run at any given year. And of course, for them, it never happened. But what happened just a few years ago with Erik Karlsson was actually a situation that had to do with Karlsson and Mike Hoffman. Now, as everybody might recall, there was that just the heartbreaking situation in Ottawa with Erik Karlsson's wife where they were expecting a child and she miscarried. That's a tremendously sad situation anytime that happens. And when that does happen, of course, there are appropriate ways to deal with that. And then, of course, there are inappropriate ways to deal with that. And Mike Hoffman's girlfriend of the time, she didn't choose the right one. A lot of people were surprised by the Karlsson trade, by the Karlsson request for a trade. It was a bit of a mystery for a time, and then we started to learn out all of the little details about how Mike Hoffman's girlfriend was basically harassing the living hell out of Erik Karlsson's wife on social media. She was creating all of these burner accounts and coming after her and doing things like, for example, like accusing her of having caused her own miscarriage and things like that. Just awful, awful, disgusting behavior. And so what happened shortly after that was that, Karlsson, he must have, somebody in that organization had to have known that this stuff was going on and just didn't put a stop to it. And so eventually what happened was not only did Erik Karlsson have to get traded, eventually they traded him to San Jose, but Mike Hoffman, he had to get traded. They moved him off to the Florida Panthers. And the wheels came off of what was a very promising Stanley Cup contender. And of course, over time, they would bring in more pieces, trying to recapture that magic. Nothing worked. And so what became was a very long and painful process of disassembly. And so you wound up with the team being, what it is today. Or if they can't go out and find what are basically spare parts in the free agent market, well, then they go to day one. They go to game number one with a lot of players who are not ready to be in the league. In this particular year, they have a goaltender. It looks like he's not ready to be there. Several wingers look like they're not ready to be there. Ottawa's an absolute disaster. Now, if you're a Winnipeg Jets fan, as you look to this Patrick Laine trade request that happened this year, where they moved him for Pierre-Luc Dubois, yes, they did get a pretty good player back for him. But when you look at that, apparently there were reports that what you're actually seeing in that situation, I think that you're actually seeing signs that your team is headed for exactly where Ottawa is now. And apparently this is actually not anything new. This started all the way back a few years ago when Evander Kane was still with the team. And it started with guys like Dustin Byfuglien. Okay, let's maybe put a pin in that. I wouldn't say that it started with Dustin Byfuglien. We don't know that. But it certainly did involve Dustin Byfuglien. So what happened with Evander Kane, it was another situation. It was another bullying situation. So Evander Kane, he comes into a player meeting. He's not dressed the way that they like players to be for player meetings. They expect guys to show up in a suit and tie for player meetings. Okay, that's not necessarily unreasonable. Evander Kane, he did faux pas a little bit. But then when they actually go out on the ice to have a practice, Byfuglien reportedly, he comes back early. He goes to the locker room. He grabs the sweatsuit that Evander Kane showed up to in this player meeting in, and he throws that in the shower, and he turns it on. Which really is just, that's just, for one thing, just what an astonishingly cowardly thing for a guy the size of Dustin Byfuglien to do. Evander Kane, who knows? Maybe Byfuglien knew that Evander Kane, that his dad trained him as a boxer when he was growing up, and maybe he was not comfortable with his ability to trade hands with Evander Kane. If a confrontation came to that. But just what an absolutely second-rate, chicken shit, just beta male way to address the situation. So passive-aggressive. It's like, let's go soak the guy's clothes. Like, just ridiculous. And then after that, lo and behold, a little while after that, Evander Kane, he asks for the trade. The one that sends him out to Buffalo. Eventually, he ends up in San Jose with Erik Karlsson. And I'm sure that a lot of those guys, they have a very similar core of stories that they could share about those two different organizations. And so now let's jump forward to this season. And let's take a look at the situation that happened with Patrik Laine. It's another surprise trade request. Nobody expected Patrik Laine to be requesting a trade. I think there were a lot of people that were under the impression, everybody seemed to know that Patrik Laine was on the market, in one form or another, but I don't think that anybody expected him to just actually stand up and tell Jets management that he wanted to be traded. But then the trade happens, and actually some more of these stories start to leak out. And this was a very interesting one that actually came to us via the Finnish press. So a lot of people, they had to go out and they had to have this story translated so they could figure out what it was saying. It was basically telling them was that there was behind-the-scenes bullying in the locker room by Mark Scheifele and by Jets captain Blake Wheeler. By some accounts, keep in mind that this is a Finnish language source and they're going to be biased towards their player. And they might give a lot of these stories maybe a little bit more credence than a lot of other sources would. Okay, let's acknowledge that. Let's be fair. Let's be fair and acknowledge that one little detail, that perhaps there is room for some question in relation to this. But basically what that story had was kind of this little theory that Blake Wheeler was jealous of the amount of attention that Patrik Laine was getting. And that Blake Wheeler, he had this idea that if he could get rid of Patrik Laine, then that spot on the top line would be his instead, and then instead he would be the one going out and getting all of those points that Patrik Laine was getting. Doesn't seem very likely to me because, let's face it, Blake Wheeler is a pretty good player, but I don't think that Blake Wheeler is the same kind of player that Patrik Laine is. I don't think that he has the same offensive topside that Patrik Laine has. Mark Scheifele, he's a much better offensive player than Blake Wheeler is. But even then, he's not a guy who's going to go out and get those Patrik Laine points. So trading Patrik Laine, even getting back a guy with Pierre-Luc Dubois, a guy who comes with very comparable talents, a guy who comes with arguably a better contract in terms of term, and money than the Patrik Laine contract. Okay, yeah, you do gain a little bit there. You don't just lose. But it is a pretty big loss, and apparently the way that it all came around, according to this Finnish language source, was that basically, reportedly, this is not known to be fact, this is a report, but reportedly, Blake Wheeler and Scheifele were going around behind the scenes, going around behind Patrik Laine's back and basically acting like a couple of snakes, back-talking him, backstabbing him, running him down with the other players, and basically undermining his position in the Jets locker room, to the point where Laine just started to find it absolutely intolerable, and then he asks for a trade. And so now here's the question that I think has to be asked. Is that if they're willing to do this with a player as who was as important to the future of the Jets as Patrick Laine was, who else are they willing to do this kind of stuff to? Who else would they adopt these kinds of tactics? Between Dustin Byfuglien and Blake Wheeler, we start to establish that there is actually a pretty long history of bullying in the Winnipeg Jets locker room, and that it's costing them players. I think that if you're a Jets fan and you see this kind of stuff going on, you have to ask yourself this question. How many years, how many months, maybe even as little as weeks, how much time are you away from a similar explosion the way that they had in Ottawa with Erik Karlsson? Is that something that could happen to your team? And is that something that Jets management should be sitting around waiting to happen? Or should they be looking at a guy like Blake Wheeler and asking themselves the same questions that Edmonton should have asked about Shane Corson much earlier in his captaincy, and saying to themselves, maybe this is not the guy to lead our team? Because as some reports have it, he's already cost you one player already. Patrick Laine is a loss for this team, and nobody should be pretending otherwise. So if you have a similar situation with that particular player, if you have a similar situation with Blake Wheeler as what the Edmonton Oilers had with Shane Corson, how long do you let that go on? Do you let that go on for as long as Ottawa let the situation with Mike Hoffman go on? Doesn't seem like a very good idea. But as I said before, let's keep in mind that there is a lot about this situation that we don't know. When you're dealing with these kinds of situations, you're dealing with a lot of stories, a lot of unconfirmed rumors. There's a lot of things that we don't know about what's going on in that locker room. You're dealing with a lot of rumors and shadow, and you do have to keep that in mind. You do have to give these players some benefit of some doubt. But speaking as an Oilers fan, the one thing that I can tell you for absolute certain is that the way that you want to find out about these things is you do not want to find out about them in hindsight. Because if you find out about these things only in hindsight, it's too late. The Ottawa Senators, they did wait until it was too late to do anything about the whole situation. If you're a Jets fan, hope that your team management does not do the same.